Thanks for joining us, folks, for Sunday School Bonanza, brought to you by This Week in Mormons. Find us at thisweekinmormons.com and on facebook.com/thisweekinmormons. We are here to bring you Gospel Doctrine Review and get you better prepared for the great things. But before we get to that, I would like to welcome back one of the newer ones to our fold. Once again, Steve Pierce is in the house.
Hello, everybody.
Woot woot. Here he is, folks. He's going to bring you his erudition and make it happen. This week's lesson, Lesson 34, Faith in Every Footstep. What did they write that song for now that I'm thinking about it? Was that to celebrate like a decennial or something like that in 1997, probably?
I just always associate it with the FY.
Arriving in the valley. That would make sense. I associate it with the Hinckley era. So I'm going to pull for it being is that how I say it? Not decennial. How do you say 150 years?
Your guess is as good as mine.
It's not a centennial. It's not a bicentennial. It's a whatever it was. So there's
1.5 centennial.
There's that song, folks. But why did they celebrate this song? Because pioneer stuff. This lesson, we are dealing basically exclusively with the trek across the plains. One thing, of course, to note is that the scriptures are full of numerous examples of people who journeyed to a promised land. And this isn't necessarily in order, but of course the Book of Mormon contains the Jaredites who lingered in the wilderness for a long time, had the barges, tight like unto a dish. Well, next thing you know, they're in the Americas doing their thing. Nephi and his family, of course, the bulk of the Book of Mormon, we find that. Other popular examples are the children of Israel in the Old Testament. And one thing I kind of love of that, I've always found a bit of a parallel in that Joseph Smith led the saints all over the places. They sort of wandered around America, but he did not get to see them kind of finish their journey in the valley, just as Moses actually never got to see the Jews enter Canaan, which is just kind of it's an interesting parallel.
It's also interesting because we often refer to Joseph as the American Moses, and I think that's for different reasons.
Yeah.
But I think that parallel is very interesting as well.
He never saw what became the Promised Land, even though in church speak today we still sort of revere northwestern Missouri as the true Zion Promised Land, but it's like we've settled for the Wasatch Front.
Yeah.
In the meantime,
it's the best we could do,
and I guess we're fine there. It worked. They were isolated enough that we were able to survive.
Yeah.
So I think it is good to think about that the Lord has commanded us to go on these journeys to promised lands at various points. And of course, this was no different for the saints. We talked last week about how conditions in Nauvoo had deteriorated to such an extent that the saints had finally decided they had to pack up, they had to leave the temple behind and go west. This was going to be it. They couldn't just keep bouncing around the Midwest and the Great Plains. They had to go somewhere much, much farther away. In this case, it was Mexico, for a year, but
yeah,
they were knowingly saying, we're leaving America, basically, and we are going somewhere away from authorities, away from oppression, and soldiering on. But it wasn't very easy, and I think that's a great thing. We learn a lot from especially from winter quarters. I think Steve's going to tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, well, the church initially planned to leave Nauvoo in April of 1846, which would have been springtime going towards summer. It would have been nice weather, and they were planning to get out. But because there was constant rumors that the Illinois State Militia was going to be coming to Nauvoo to prevent them from leaving, they actually end up having to leave early in February of 1846. So when they leave Nauvoo to go to winter quarters, it's the end of winter, going into a rainy spring, and so the road and the travel to winter quarters is very tough. And they actually only go 310 miles to winter quarters, but it takes them 131 days to get there. And the going is slow, and it's cold at the first part, and then it rains a lot once it gets into the spring, and and people die, and it's awful.
It's terrible. And to put that in a modern perspective, the distance, it's basically just crossing modern day Iowa, effectively. Yeah. They went across Iowa. Winter quarters today is basically just Omaha. Mm-hmm. And that's why there's a temple today, and it's just in suburban Omaha, Nebraska, just so you all have a kind of a context right there. They basically went from the Mississippi River to the Missouri River.
Yeah, it's not a long jaunt, but it takes them 131 days, and it's interesting because it's so tough, and they experience so much hardship. But at the same time, it can kind of be seen as a preparatory journey where they learn and where they grow and kind of figure things out for the longer journey that they will eventually take from winter quarters to Salt Lake Valley, which is 1,000 miles, and they do it in 21 fewer days. So they do it 3 weeks faster, but go more than three times as far. So they kind of ironed out the kinks going from Nauvoo to winter quarters. And so while it was a really tough time and it was really a lot of hardship, there's a lot to be learned there.
Mm-hmm. And how else did the Lord, because Section 136 is full of a lot of instructions, especially just preparations, I think, that the Lord told him to do. in order to get ready. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that, like for example, in in verse 3 of that section, the Lord instructed them to organize companies under the direction of the 12 with a president, 2 counselors, a captain of hundreds, 50s, 10s, which I think is a very obvious analog to how we organize things in the church today. I mean, but it makes sense. They went in an organized fashion. They had to iron the kinks out, but this wasn't just the saints packing up with the 12 kind of vaguely leading them, perhaps, and it was just a free-for-all across the plains hoping they made it. It was a very, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a reasonable, regimented, organized process.
No, it's very orderly, and that's essentially what Doctrine and Covenants section 136 is. That revelation is given in January of 1847. They don't leave for another few months, but that's essentially the Lord setting forth and saying, to Brigham Young, through Brigham Young, this is how you're going to do it. You're going to leave in a few months. You're going to set forth in this structure, and you're going to prepare in this way. You're going to prepare for those who are going to have to stay behind. You're going to take care of the poor. And he gives very specific instructions. And, if you've ever led a large group of people in any type of undertaking, let alone leading them across the plains from a place like Winter Quarters to the Salt Lake Valley, which is 1,000 miles, and in the initial company there was about 3,500 people, that if you don't have specific guidelines and specific rules and specific structures in place, you are not going to succeed. So this is the Lord preparing the saints to succeed in this massive undertaking, which is going to be hard. But it's made a little bit easier by the fact that the Lord prepares them and tells them exactly what they need to do to get ready.
Exactly. And then building on that, he also, as we move sort of into the next part of the lesson, the Lord also gave them very specific instructions, not just on how to be organized, but on their conduct while they were out doing this, which is interesting because, of course, we have conduct just from the general, just living the gospel and everything. But to just kind of pick apart some of the specifics here, it says, of course, if any man seek to build power up himself and seeketh not my counsel, he shall have no power. I think that humility was very important, and also given everything they dealt with in the still reasonably unresolved succession crisis, but those who chose to follow the 12, obviously, I think at this point the Lord is trying to remind them, like, hey, I don't want more people trying to think they can rise up and take power into themselves and guide and take the reins of this entire experience. Also, of course, don't take the Lord's name in vain. I think that's exceptionally important. I think during a grueling period of time, it would be a lot easier, of course, to blaspheme in that sense and be frustrated. But cease to contend with one another, return borrowed or lost items, and be diligent in preserving what thou hast. And that one's interesting to me because I think that one's a great precursor in the way I honestly read that and I think of emergency preparedness in a sense. Preserving what thou hast, be ready for the worst. And it's obviously a huge part of who we are as Latter-day Saints today, to have our food supply and our emergency kits and all that stuff. So.
Yeah, and all that's really, all that focus on, preservation and being a wise steward and preparing for the worst, that all is very informed by the early years of our faith and these travails that the church went to when we were a very, people think of the church now as being very affluent and, having all these investments, but for most of the church's history, we were a very impoverished people. And so preparing for the future and storing up for the hard times, especially when you're making a trek across the United States, that's important stuff. And I think what's really interesting about some of these directions that the Lord gives in section 136 that you just touched on is that all of them, for the most part, a lot of them are really governing and giving advice on how to interact with one another and deal with your fellow man. And when you think about, in context, what they're doing, they're out in the middle of nowhere, trekking across vast expanses of nothingness at this point. And if they don't stick together and if they don't keep together and if they break apart, people die and things go badly and they don't make it to their destination. People die, people get sick, people get hurt. And things that would sow those seeds of discord, like saying like return, borrow, or lost items, that seems kind of silly now. But think about, in a church where we have, histories of top leaders leaving over milk strippings. Those types of seemingly small personal things and like just basic, like how do you treat your fellow human beings and brothers and sisters in Zion and stuff, that stuff can grow and become a powder keg that splits people and divides people, especially when you're in a stressful environment like these people are in. So I see these guidelines as really a way to stay unified and a way to keep that unity of purpose and spirit as you undertake this really tough task.
And we find it's funny because, of course, they still struggled well after the fact once the Saints were pretty much entrenched in Utah. I mean, the church, the interesting thing is a lot of the leadership councils in the church functioned in a civic capacity for a long time as well, to adjudicate involving just stupid things like this. If it was stealing from your neighbor, if it was water rights, all these amazing things affected them much more on a real basis in the way the church was governed at that time. It wasn't until much, much later that the church kind of finally bowed out and let then, Utah territory law be the law, and then let, religious law be the other thing. Another thing, a bit of instruction. I just want to read this because I honestly think it's kind of amusing, but in a good way. President David O. McKay taught about appropriate recreation. This is a good thing for us to consider. And so this is what President McKay taught. And I love President McKay. It says, on the plains after a day's march, the wagons were drawn up in a circle. A man with the violin would take his place by the campfire, and there on the prairie, the sturdy pioneers would join hands in a dance, opening it by a prayer and participate in amusement that fostered the spirit of the gospel. President Brigham Young once said, in substance, the atmosphere of the dance should be such that if any elder be called from the party to go to administer to a sick person, he could leave with the same spirit that he would go from his elders' quorum meeting.
So I guess the long and short of it is, after a long day pulling your handcart, it's cool to cut loose, but don't cut too loose.
Don't cut too loose. So this is a message. This is an honest criticism. Youth dances in the church today. I'm not one that's like wild. I don't care a ton about censorship and stuff, but if we're trying to have standards, we need to perhaps just think about some of the songs that are sometimes played at church dances, which can be extremely sexually suggestive.
Are there any ones that you really want to call out specifically?
Just Usher in general.
Usher. He can cut a little too loose at times.
Just cuts too loose. He can't go administer to anybody.
Well,
All right. So eventually, the Saints make it to the Salt Lake Valley. So, huzzah, they finally arrive. They get into the Rocky Mountains. I love that there was Joseph Smith did prophesy about this, though. He said that, quote, the Saints would continue to suffer much affliction and would be driven to the Rocky Mountains, and that some of them would live to go and assist in making settlements and build cities and see the Saints become a mighty people in the midst of the Rocky Mountains, which is awesome. And that was way back in, so that's what Joseph Smith history, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. It happened way before the fact, but the prophet knew it was going to come eventually. He knew they'd have to go settle elsewhere on the rim of the Great Basin. I don't honestly have a ton to add on to them arriving in the valley other than they had problems as well, but they stuck around. They built up their society, and today we have Utah. So
yeah, I mean, you have 70,000 people that make that trek over the next 20 years and ultimately land in Utah, and a lot of those companies were difficult and had difficulties and struggles, and they went at different times of the year and faced the elements. The lesson actually mentions one of my favorite stories from the history of the church, which is the story of Mary Fielding Smith, who crosses the plains. She's Hiram Smith's second wife after his first wife, Jerusha, dies, and Hiram had 5 kids with his first wife, and Mary Fielding Smith agrees to take them in as her own, and then Hiram, of course, is assassinated, and so Mary Fielding Smith chooses to go with the 12, and she lugs 5 children with her across the plains by herself. No man. This is like the epitome of strong, independent woman. And when she sets out in 1848 to leave from winter quarters to the Salt Lake Valley, the head of her handcart company, this brother, says, you're not ready for this. You can't take 5 kids across the plains by yourself without any help. You need to stay here. You need to get more prepared. You need to get somebody to help you. And she basically tells him, look, I'm going, and I'm going to be there before you will, and I'm not going to ask for your help. And she beats him there by 20 hours ultimately, because she's just awesome. And she
power. Yeah,
and she has difficulty along the way, and her son is obviously Joseph Fielding Smith, who becomes the prophet, and he's 9 at the time, and he's driving the wagons, and it's hard for them, but they make do. And I think her story is inspiring because of for me it's a strong, independent woman, and it's going through adversity and relying on the Lord and all those things to ultimately get to the promised land. But I think it's also representative of so many other members of the church at this time who this is not an ideal thing for them. They really suffered and went through hard times to get here, but it was so important for them to get to Utah. It was so important for them to find that promised land and to follow the quorum of the 12. And so they went through a lot, and it was worth it. And so I think that's inspiring.
It is inspiring, and they toughed it out. I mean, I know one of the great reasons we try to remember our pioneer heritage in the church is because we have it a lot better than they ever did. And I think it's important that that's why we do it, though. So we have that perspective to remember these people went through insane things, but they toughed it out, and they stuck with it. They didn't let their faith waver. They kept going. They arrived. They made it work. And it's just amazing to me when, of course, we face different things in our journey, in our journey into our promised land, our journey of exaltation in these modern days. But it's amazing how easy it can be for us to also get sidetracked when perhaps, respectively, there's not as much on our plate that we might have had, at least not as much as far as physical maladies and just trudging through life and making it happen. It is all relative. But
it is.
But I very much appreciate what these pioneers did, and that's a thing, and it's amazing how much of an effect that's had on our church. And we talk about it all the time. We have songs all about pioneers. It's this massive chunk of who we are.
Yeah, very much defines. I mean, there's a couple. If you were to ask somebody, even somebody that's not a member of the church, who has very limited knowledge of Mormons, and you ask, what do you think? What are things that come to mind when you think about Mormons? You'd probably get polygamy. You'd probably get a few other things. And one of the things that you would get is this pioneer heritage. We're known, at least in America, as some of those first groups to really settle the American West and make that trek across. And it's a huge part of who we are, and it defines and feeds into so much of who we are today. A lot of the things we care about, like food storage and emergency preparedness and stuff like that, feed out of that early experience and the really tremendous and Herculean undertaking that these people that they did.
That said, I think it's a good thing from a church standpoint, but I will say that Pioneer Day confuses the heck out of saints abroad. They do not understand why.
Yeah, well.
I mean, when I've been abroad, they're like, what? Huh? What? Hand carts? Wagons? These are just alien concepts to people elsewhere. So it's good to honor, I think, the church heritage, but from like the societal, cultural standpoint, it's just totally lost on the saints in India and Japan and whatever else. But
fair enough.
That's okay, though. I mean, it all works out. Well, folks, we hope you'll read up on Pioneer Day. Of course, read sections 136 is really the big one to hit on today. If you're reading Our Heritage, pages 71 through 77. We glossed over some other things like the ship Brooklyn, but hey, a boat went to San Francisco and then they came the other way. So pick your poison. Go around the Cape, go to San Francisco, cross Nevada. I don't know.
They got there in the end.
I honestly think crossing Nevada is probably worse than crossing the Great Plains.
There's not very much water in Nevada.
No, it's terrible. So lesson 34, faith in every footstep. Steve, thanks for being with us.
No problem, sir.
Appreciate having you here, folks. Hope you'll find us at Twitter, Facebook, at thisweekinmormons.com, all that stuff. Subscribe, do it all.